This is Christopher Sernaque, hosting episode 13 of season 1 of the Current Topics in Science podcast. This podcast will address breaking scientific news in light of the origins debate and host interviews with scientists. This podcast is available on the following platforms: iTunes, Stitcher, Google Podcast, Spotify, and iHeartRadio. Video recordings of the podcast will be uploaded to YouTube. Enjoy the podcast. Today on Current Topics in Science, we have the honor of hosting Dr. Danny Faulkner. Dr. Faulkner has a PhD in astronomy from Indiana University, a Master's of Science in both astronomy and physics from Indiana University and Clemson University, respectively, and a Bachelor of Science in Math from Bob Jones University. Dr. Faulkner is a member of the American Astronomical Society and was the full professor of astronomy, physics, and chair division of math, science, nursing, and public health at the University of South Carolina, Lancaster, where he taught physics and astronomy. Dr. Danny Faulkner has published over 100 papers in various scientific journals and is the author of the book Universe by Design. Dr. Faulkner has been in several creation documentaries, such as Is Genesis History?, and has defended biblical creation in debates, interviews, books, articles, and research. He's a member of the Creation Research Society and Answers in Genesis. Dr. Faulkner and his wife have been married for 44 years, and they are the proud parents of a grown son. Now, without further ado, good morning, Dr. Faulkner. How is your day, and how are you doing?
Good morning. I'm doing well. Doing very well. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you. It's an absolute pleasure to have you on Current Topics in Science. And since this is Current Topics in Science, we're going to quickly look at this week's current topic. According to Space.com, April's super pink moon is the biggest full moon of 2020. According to Joe Rao, the guest lecturer at New York's Hayden Planetarium, on Tuesday, this April 7th at 2:08 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, the moon will arrive at its closest point to Earth in 2020. It's a distance of about 200,021,772 miles away, and about 8.5 hours later, the moon will officially turn full. Jesse Emspak, another author for Space.com, explains why this moon is called pink, saying, "The name Pink Moon comes from the bloom and ground phlox, a pink flower common in North America, according to the Old Farmer's Almanac." Dr. Faulkner, what do you think of this super pink moon, and how does the moon itself fit into the biblical creation model?
Well, many people don't realize it, but the moon doesn't have a circular orbit around the Earth. It has an elliptical orbit, which means it's got one point closest to the Earth called the perigee, and one point that's farthest away called the apogee. And the difference in distance is around 12 to 14%. It's noticeable, actually, but not to the naked eye. If you go out on this night that we have a full moon, or a night or two either side, the moon probably won't look any bigger than it normally does. That's because the eye is not really reliable at determining sizes in an absolute sense. If you can set two things of different sizes next to each other, well, that makes a big difference. Your eye can pick that out very nicely. And I've looked at a couple of these in the past. We had one a little over a year ago in January of 2019. There was a total lunar eclipse, and I took some photos of that eclipse. And I noticed at the time that the moon looked little large in the telescope I was using. And sure enough, it occurred, that full moon of the eclipse occurred within 12 hours or so of perigee as well. So it was one of those super moons as well. And then I waited 9 months, September of last year, 2019, and I took a photograph at full moon when it was near apogee. And I put the two next to each other, and you can see that one's 14% larger than the other one. It's pretty obvious, but only when you have two photographs made with the same camera and same telescope. So if you're expecting it to look unusually large, you're going to be disappointed because the eye really can't see that very well. Keep in mind, the moon's only about a half degree across, so it doesn't change in size, apparent size very much at all. And each of the months throughout the year are given different names. There's a hunter's moon, the harvest moon, the different types of things. This is what the pink moon, as you described, is all about. Now, the moon we know was made on day 4, is one of the two great lights that God put in the sky. And it has served several purposes. For time reckoning is one. For instance, the month is based upon that. We don't follow a strictly lunar or even a lunisolar month anymore. Julius Caesar changed that over 2,000 years ago. But again, our months are based upon that lunar cycle. And the moon has other effects. It produces tides on the earth. You live there in Jacksonville. You're probably well aware of the tides. If you go to the beach, it's going to go up and down. We don't notice it too much here where I live in the middle of the country. But the moon provides light at night. It's interesting that the Passover, the very first one there in Egypt, occurred at the time, and it appears to me, we're reading reading the account. It sounds like they were told to leave in the middle of the night. And if you ever go outside at night with the full moon, you can see quite well. I've actually done this on a lonely road a couple of times, nobody around. Full moon, I've turned my headlights off. I don't recommend you do this much. I drive for a while and I could actually see well enough to get around. I always turn my headlights back on just in case somebody else is coming the other direction doing the same thing I'm doing. You want to make sure that but it's amazing how well you can see with a full moon. So it provides light on the earth, as the Bible says, the tides, the basis for our calendar, and also some other interesting design aspects of the moon I've written about. I don't think we have time to talk about today. Maybe a future time we can get together and do it some more. But the moon is a fascinating object, and I think it speaks of God's creation.
Amen. And while we are on the subject of the creation model, Dr. Faulkner, in your chapter in the book, In 6 Days, Why 50 Scientists Choose to Believe in Creation, you wrote, the best exegesis of the creation account of Genesis 1 is that the days were literal, roughly 24-hour days. To add to that thought, in your debate with Hugh Ross, you said that you've seen the definition of science gradually change from the study of the world using 5 senses to the search for natural explanations. Dr. Faulkner, does science exclude the supernatural? Does science explain away God?
Oh, of course not. Science doesn't explain away God at all. There are limitations to science. The science, as I like the original definition, is a study of the natural or physical world, and God is spirit, as Jesus told us in the Gospels. And so God is not physical. He's not natural. He's supernatural. He's metaphysical. And so there's absolutely no scientific test or experiment you could do, if you could perform to check God's existence. It's just beyond science to do that. Now, this doesn't mean that God doesn't exist, just means that science is limited in this respect. You need to change your paradigm when you go to these things, go to something spiritual rather than the physical. And the concern I have is that people have redefined science in a way that it precludes any possibility of God. If you define science as the search for natural explanations, then you a priori have excluded any possibility of the supernatural, the metaphysical, if you will, a God or a creator God. And this is problematic because what if you encounter something that has no physical or natural explanation? For instance, the origin of life is an excellent example of that. And if you are limiting yourselves to just physical or natural explanations, then you have no explanation for that, no answer to that question. And so if you're going to stick to that definition of science, then you're going to have to make up a natural explanation. It doesn't matter how illogical it may be, how improbable it may be, even how irrational it may be, because your definition of science is, from the get-go, has excluded the possibility of a supernatural origin of things, then you're going to have to make up that explanation. I think I've just described biological evolution and the abiogenesis, which, by the way, goes against all good science. So I think scientists are making a real mistake when they try to redefine science in this way, because it leads them to a wrong conclusion about so many things.
Now that we are on the subject of how God and science relate, let's move on to discussing further aspects of the creation model. Dr. Faulkner, in a video called Q&A with Del Tackett and the scientists, you said, "We in the creation literature are putting up new models and theories all the time. And I think we should have more theories and models. Let people put them up, shoot at them, knock them down, and come up with another one. That's how science works." Dr. Faulkner, is there a creation theory or model in your view that needs to be updated or discarded entirely?
Oh, a great example of that would be what we call the canopy model. This was a belief that many, myself, I include myself in this, believe that on day two, God made the atmosphere, and it was above that was this water. If you read the day two account in verses 6 through 8 of Genesis 1, it talks about this thing called the rakia, or expanse, and with the water above. And the idea was that this thing condensed or collapsed at the time of the flood, and it was a major part of the flood. Turns out most creation scientists today and most creation ministries have abandoned that idea. It's not gotten into the pews yet. I kind of all the time. I speak to people and say, "What? The canopy is not a good theory anymore?" No, it's not. We've most of us have left that behind for something else. It's changed my cosmology completely. I think day two's not talking about the atmosphere anymore. But we creation scientists, we have debates and arguments among the geologists, which I'm not. They have big fights among themselves about the flood models they have. You know, what caused the flood, how the flood progressed. And I don't have time to go into that, nor would I be the best person to discuss that. In my own field of astronomy, we've had a debate about where craters on the moon came from. And for that matter, craters on other bodies in the solar system. And one prominent idea for many years was that those most of them resulted from the effects of the fall back in Genesis chapter 3. And I began arguing against that about 2 decades ago, arguing that maybe many of the craters date to the day four creation when God put the moon together. The craters, many of those could represent the final stages of how he put the moon together on day four, very miraculously and very quickly. And we've debated this among a little circle of creation scientists, and I've won some people over a little bit. Many of them think that maybe I'm onto something here, and they started out disagreeing with me, started agreeing with me. By the way, I do believe that there was probably a secondary bunch of impacts at the time of the flood. That's been my model I'm working on, and there are many other examples of where people put forth a model, and maybe people embrace it for a while, and then we walk away from it eventually. That's the nature of science. Science. Why should we creation scientists be any different?
I agree, and that was actually really interesting. I didn't know that we get into the origin of the moon craters, and that was actually something that I'm glad you got into. Well, actually, while we are on the subject of that Q&A, in that self-same Q&A, you said, evolution, by its very nature, is an attempt to explain the existence of the world apart from any involvement of a creator. While you believe that the evolutionary theory is incorrect, in your chapter of the book In 6 Days, Why 50 Scientists Choose to Believe in a Creator, you wrote, "Do not think that creationists have all the answers. There are many perplexing problems that we must study within our starting assumptions." Dr. Faulkner, what is one question concerning creation that you wish you had the answer to?
Oh, I've been searching for years for some sort of creation-based model of stellar astronomy. That's the part of astronomy I specialize in and interests me the most. And I've been working on that for years, and I still don't have a handle on that. You know, the secular astronomers, and I'm well versed in this, having gone through graduate classes, and even some of the research I do touches upon this. They have very elaborate models of how stars supposedly form and how they age and how they die. They go through this cycle, and it's based upon some pretty good physics, I might add, and what we know about nuclear physics and also the theories of gases and so forth. How much of this can we accept? How much do we need to reject? You know, what's the proper approach we should take? The one huge difference I see is that the evolutionists are committed to millions of years, and I'm not. I think the world is fairly young. So if I went to interpret all of this in a very robust physical manner, would I reach some different conclusions and make different predictions than the secular science would, the stellar evolutionary science would? And I think I would, but we've just not developed that enough. I wish I knew we could make more progress. That's one of the big issues I see out there.
Speaking of making progress, when you were speaking to Del Tackett, you said, "The older I get, the more I want other people who come behind me. Hopefully I've set a pretty good foundation, but they need to build on that and go farther than I ever went." Dr. Faulkner, where would you like to see the creation movement go? What new ground are you interested in seeing broken?
I've already mentioned the very great need for a true biblically based stellar astronomy, creation based. It's not there yet. Another one is cosmology, the structure of the universe, and if you will, the cosmogony, the history of the universe. There have been some rudimentary attempts at that, most of them motivated more by trying to solve what we call the light travel time problem. I would like to see a approach that addresses the cosmology without worrying about any kind of baggage that you want to shed yourself of at some point. And I made a few rudimentary approaches on that as well. I think we need a good planetary astronomy. Right now, we talked a little about craters across the solar system. We've made a little progress there. But why are there 8 planets in the solar system? Why are there 2 types of planets? Why are they different? Is there a purpose or design there? And I've made a little bit of progress on a couple of those, but there's a lot of unanswered questions there. Why do all the satellites of the solar system rotate and revolve at the same rate, or most of them do? The evolutionists have an answer for that. We don't. So can we answer that question as well? You know, I get together with a few creation astronomers about every year or so, and we hash through a lot of these questions, and we're just getting started. I kind of feel left out. The biologists and the geologists who are creationists, I think, have made a lot of progress. I think many of them would say, "What? Are you out of your mind? We haven't made much progress at all." I said, "Well, you made more progress than we have." So I'm kind of envious. I think I'd like to get in the situation they are, where we have just some big fights among ourselves about our different models. Not gentlemanly fights, not angry with one another, but arguments about these things.
That's interesting. Actually, I'm going to ask you a question that wasn't on the script, if you don't mind, because this one's pretty interesting. There's a few different models. I know Dr. Lyle has a model, Dr. Humphreys has a model, Dr. Harnett has a model, all relating to the distant starlight problem, which you mentioned. Do you have one that you prefer, or do you believe that that question still needs a more viable answer to it?
You mean the lifetime solution or the
Hmm.
cosmology? No, the lifetime problem. I have my own. I like it better. I believe that God intervened miraculously on day 4. Not only did he make the stars on day 4, but he also, and all astronomical bodies, but he also brought that light here. I kind of parallel it with day 3 account. It says that God caused the plants to grow up out of the ground. It doesn't say that they were created instantly. It doesn't say they were created ex nihilo. It says the plants were to grow up out of the ground, and they did. And they had to do that to fulfill their function, provide food for both man and beast to just come along a few days later. And I see that all the way through the creation account. You see purpose and design there in each time. The stars have certain purposes, but they couldn't fulfill their purposes if they could not be visible. So I think God brought that light here. Now people have suggested through changing speed of light, or through gravitational field of being involved there, some relativistic effects, all sorts of physical mechanisms there. But I think the problem is people are looking for physical answers. Now, as a scientist, I understand that. I like to look for physical answers too. But there's a lot in the creation account, in fact, just about all of it, which is pretty miraculous. You had nothing, and then you had energy and space and matter and time. That violates everything we know about these things. You had life coming spontaneously up out of the ground for the land animals, out of the water for the sea animals, and flying things came out of the ground as well, apparently, and plants coming up out of the ground. None of that what we see today. Everything you see in the creation account is very miraculous. But suddenly, when it comes to this light travel time problem, we want a physical, natural explanation. That's not the way it works. You might as well seek out a physical explanation for the virgin birth or the resurrection.
Wow. I'm glad I asked that question. That was actually a really interesting answer.
I gave it the short version. There's a longer version.
What I like is that there's so much to discuss on all of these different things, and you can see that there's plenty of potential, there's plenty of avenues for the creation movement to go down, lots of fields for study. Actually, speaking of breaking new ground, we're going to go from new ground to maybe a little bit more controversial ground. Dr. Faulkner, you have a DVD called Climate Change or Mind Control. In the trailer for your documentary, you mentioned everything from polar bears to Coca-Cola to Al Gore to government control, and of course the validity of climate change concerns. Dr. Faulkner, how do you believe that creationists should view the climate change idea? Is it really mind control?
That DVD was put out 8 or 9 years ago, so it's been a while. It's actually, I was just the talking head. The other people put the title on and so forth. But in the program, I discussed well, actually, there are two questions that I try to address. One is the climate changing? Is it getting warmer? And number two, are we responsible for all of that? I just thinking the other day, I would add now, if I gave that presentation, add a third question to it. Um, does it really matter? That if we are changing it, does it really matter if we're changing it? And I think the first answer to the first question is, well, climates do change. The flood was a huge change. We see historical records. Libya, North Africa, was the breadbasket of the Roman Empire. It can't be anymore. There's been desertification that's occurred, and many of these things are beyond our control. We have many historical examples of the Little Ice Age. A few hundred years ago, the warm period, 1,000 years ago. It's just those things are beyond our control. Suddenly, we think in the late 20th, now in the 21st century, we're causing all this pandemonium here. And then on top of that, even secular scientists agree that the world was much warmer at one point, significantly warmer than it is today. There's a lot more CO2 in the atmosphere in the past, and they would argue long before humans showed up. Well, if that's the case, then is a lot of CO2 we're putting in the air really that big of an issue? I mean, after all, the Earth seems to be resilient in all these things. Having said all of that, I believe in stewardship. I don't believe in ecology. I love stewardship. We're given the instruction, Adam was, and I think as a federal head, it redounds down to us to take care of things. We're in charge of what's going on around here, and we should be responsible. I've personally I've been recycling stuff since the early 60s. I was a little kid. I'd take my lunch to school in a sack and I'd throw my trash away, but I'd fold the sack up and stick it back in my pocket and take it home. It's a good sack. Why can't I use it again and again? And I was doing it long before that was cool. In the 60s, everything was used once and throw away. I never bought into that sort of stuff. So I do believe in reusing, recycling, cutting back, and being responsible about things. If we can reduce CO2 emissions, that's fine with me. I just object when it's done in a very heavy-handed manner, and some of the things we're being told we need to do. And so I've got kind of mixed feelings about it. I'm not thinking, well, we just need to just pillage the earth. I think we should take care of it, and we can do that. We can also do our industry and do things like that at the same time.
Now, you mentioned back when you were a child. You had mentioned 6 years old. I'm going to take you back to when you were 4 years old. In an interview with Dr. Weil and Dr. Sarfati, you said, well, I can honestly say there hasn't been a time in my life when I've not been interested in astronomy. I recall being 3 or 4 years old, looking up at the sky, being amazed what was up there. Dr. Faulkner, what would you say to a 4-year-old who wants to grow up to be an astronomer and glorify God with his or her education?
I would encourage people to do that they need to seek out what God has for them in their life. I was just a 4 or 5-year-old when I first really got hooked on the stars and what's up in the sky. I got into school, learned how to read, and I would go to school library and check out all the books. And pretty soon I read both of them, and I would read astronomy books that I could find. They were hard to find when I was a kid. There's a lot more resources today, more books, and also things online you could check out. Didn't exist. The internet didn't exist back then. But I just learned about these things. But I did it because I enjoyed it. I wasn't thinking about a career. I was too busy being a kid. And I didn't give any thought to what I wanted to do with my life until I was a sophomore in high school. That year, several big things happened in my life. And one of them was I began to realize that this was my calling in life. People were talking about dedicating your life to Lord's service, and they tend to think in terms of being a pastor or being a teacher or being a missionary, and they think, oh no, I have to go to the Timbuktu, some far off place, and have to suffer. Turns out I've known plenty of missionaries, and they say, you know what, I'm doing just what God made me to do, and can't think of being anywhere else. And they're very happy with what they're doing because they're doing what they were called to do and made to do. Well, the Lord needs those people, missionaries and pastors and so forth, but he also needs accountants and engineers and scientists and attorneys. Boy, does he need attorneys. And so constantly, I like to make lawyer jokes if I can. I've known too many lawyers, and they tell me good lawyer jokes too, but I digress. God needs scientists. And so I encourage young people a little older than 4 usually, but if they have the aptitude and they have the ability, not just anybody can do this. And if they have the calling, that's important too. Just because you're good at it doesn't mean what your calling is. You need to seek that out. And that's what I did. And I've been doing it. That was 50 years ago. And I'm very happy, always been very happy with what I do. Don't feel like I've been employed. I mean, I work, but I supposedly work. I mean, I'm doing what I enjoy. I love to do. If I retired in the sense I'd stop working, I'd still be doing what I'm doing now. So why would I want to quit working? I love what I do, and it's because I'm doing exactly what God made me to do. So young people, you need to seek that out and search that out. Find out what God wants you to do.
Amen. I couldn't actually, real quick, just a side note. Actually, my dad, he told me a lawyer joke. He said, "What do you call 10,000 lawyers at the bottom of the sea?"
A good
A good
start.
start.
I've heard them all. And by the way, attorneys told me that joke. I didn't. I joke with attorneys, and most attorneys like to tell those jokes themselves.
Amen. Well, God needs everybody from the accountants, the bakers, the scientists. Actually, let's now go all the way to the other end of the educational spectrum. So we started with 4-year-old Danny Faulkner. Let's go to Dr. Danny Faulkner, who was an associate professor at the University of South Carolina, Lancaster, where you taught physics and astronomy. Dr. Faulkner, what advice would you give to a new creationist professor in a secular university about how to go about navigating their way through that role?
Yeah. First of all, one correction: I was a full professor there, not just associate professor.
Okay.
Yeah. And when I retired, they gave me the title of Distinguished Professor Emeritus. I tell people it's the first time in my life that my name and distinguished have been put together in the same context. But um, I in grad school, let's go back a little farther. In grad school, I kind of held down a little bit. I didn't go looking for trouble. Most of us, you have to get through grad school in a secular institution. And people knew I was a Christian. That was no secret. And I didn't really get quizzed about my beliefs about the age of the earth and creation and so forth. Later on, it came out, and they were okay with that. The astronomy department, they've been very good to me over the years. I have no complaints. We have a good relationship. When I began teaching at the university, soon it came out that I was a Christian. They knew it was in South Carolina, and Bob Jones is there, so they knew about Bob Jones. I hadn't been there too long, and I had a professor ask me. He was a history professor, just was curious, and I told him. And then I began doing more creation work, and the word got out. And I was in an unusual situation. My situation's a bit different. You may have remember the movie Expelled with Ben Stein. Not every story is like that. Mine is not. When one of the head of the honors department on our campus, later on my campus dean, by the way, he found out I was a creationist. He thought that was really cool and didn't agree with me, but he thought it was really cool. And he wanted to do an honors class about that. And we did that for two years in a row. And he was very supportive of me. In fact, when I wrote my first book 17 years ago, he was a campus dean then. And when he gave him a copy of the book, when I first got a copy, and I knew what he was going to say, the first words out of his mouth were, "Let's do a book signing." And they invited all these people in. And that night, he gave me about the best introduction I had ever gotten in my life. He was a class act, and he was very proud. He said a few people in the community had called and wanted to know, why are you giving this guy any attention at all? And he said, hey, he wrote a book. I wish all my professors would write a book. So he was very protective. And over the years, I've had people try to get me in trouble. Even after I left, because I'm distinguished professor emeritus, some people tried to call the administration, email, and write letters and complain. And they've always went to bat for me. The University of South Carolina, the academic freedom is alive and well. Having said that, many places are not like that at all. I think you got to file this under being wise as serpents and harmless as doves. You've got to seek the leading of the Lord in these things. You need not to run, particularly when you are a professor, because if you're called to be a creation scientist, then you need to be out of the closet at some point. I mean, I couldn't fathom it being at the university, hiding all the stuff that I do in creation and doing it, on the slide somewhere, like I'm hiding what I'm doing somewhere. That was always above board. I got more invitations to speak and to write, and for the most part, my colleagues were supportive. One thing they noticed about me early on was that I was a good professor. I was a good teacher. I got good student reviews. One year I was the teacher of the year on our campus. I also was active in campus affairs and university affairs. I was on the faculty senate for years and years. I was went through the leadership of the Senate faculty senate we had twice. Um, so I was also a leader in the community, involved in many things. So I was a valuable asset to the community, and they recognized my teaching excellence. And so most of my colleagues were okay. Well, if he's just a little off the reservation on this, that's okay, you know. And you find professors that sometimes would push other agendae, which were not real popular with people. I won't go into examples. I don't think I need to do that. But that's academic freedom, and it should be observed. And again, I know a very good friend of mine who lost a tenure track job, was denied tenure because he was a creationist. So you got to pick your battles carefully. And I can't give one size fits all sort of advice here, but it's a tough call. I just feel blessed. The Lord put me in the place I was supposed to be. I spent more than a quarter century there. I took me about 10 or 15 years to figure out why I happened to be there, and I think I figured that out after a while. And I was very happy there. I could have spent the rest of my life at that campus, but I felt a real desire and a calling to in retirement to pursue creation science full time. And if it's a certain thing you're going to do, you need to do it earlier rather than later. So 8 years ago, I had the opportunity to retire a little bit early. And so I've been here at Answers in Genesis. I'm in my 8th year here, and I'm doing full-time research and writing. It's been the most productive time of my life. Since I've been here, I've published 4 books, and I've got several others in the works. So it's uh, it's been really, really good to be here. And I can't be more happy what I'm doing. But again, if it hadn't been for this desire to be here and the calling to be here, I could easily still be back at the university because I love that town, love that campus, love the church I was in. I could have spent the rest of my life there.
Thank you so much for sharing that testimony. And I like what you said about how the university, they treated you nicely, but that shows that there's some hope, because normally you actually mentioned the film Expelled, and then I know several cases I've spoken to individuals where they end up not getting their PhD because the professor somehow found out that they were creationist. But I'm glad that you were able to share a little bit of hope, because it shows that it's not always a bleak situation. There's definitely a light, or there's a glimmer of light at the end of the tunnel. Now, the time's actually come for our final question. Dr. Danny Faulkner, you and I share one thing, or at least this one thing, in common. In your biography on the Answers to Genesis website, the section entitled Personal Information indicates that you enjoy coin collecting. So do I. This is...
It used to be more fun back when I was a little kid because there were a lot of old coins in circulation. When they lost the silver in 1965, when the nickel clad copper, all those old coins disappeared. I will say that the new state quarters and the national park quarters and the new design on the nickels and pennies have made coin collecting fun again. It really has.
I think I almost have all of the 50 states here. I got this bank when I got this little piggy bank when I was in 4th grade. We went field trip to Merchants Bank. But I'm going to tie this into a little object lesson. The Apostle Paul writes in Ephesians chapter 1, verse 7, "In whom we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of sins, according to the riches of his grace." Dr. Danny Faulkner, I'm sure that you can agree that the forgiveness of Christ is of far greater value than your coin collection and my coin collection combined. So, for someone who's been convicted by some of the evidences you've shared and by your testimony, may you please share with us how we can receive the grace of Jesus Christ.
Well, I came to salvation when I was age 6. I just finished 1st grade. I was going on 7. It was at a vacation Bible school. I very much believe in child evangelism. And during that week, I understood for the first time that I was a sinner and I was separated from God. And the future for me was very bleak considering all of that. And I was remorseful, as much as a 6-year-old can be, over the sin in my life. It was not a huge amount of sin, but 6-year-olds, they do sin. And so for the first time in my life, I understood I was a sinner and what the penalty was, what the consequences were. And I also understood for the first time that God sent his only son, Jesus Christ, into the world to live a perfect life and then to lay down his life in sacrifice for us, taking the penalty of death that was due us because of our sinful nature. And in repentance, turning to him, believing and trusting in his finished work on the cross for me. And that's as simple as it is. It's a gift. It's totally a gift of God. It's nothing we can earn on our own. It's simply recognizing, accepting that free gift of God's salvation through his son, Jesus Christ.
Amen. Dr. Faulkner, thank you very much for your time. It was an absolute joy. And to our listeners, thank you very much for taking the time to learn with us on current topics in science, where scientific discoveries are examined in light of the origins issue. Please share and subscribe to the Current Topics in Science podcast. It's available on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and iHeartRadio. You can find Dr. Faulkner's books. You can find them in the description. They're available for free, along with his biography, publications, documentaries, and the Answers in Genesis website. Thanks again for listening, and remember, the truth saves.